All right, just wanted to make sure that we're live. And we are.
We're both wearing black.
I, it's just comfort. I don't.
I know. It's like all I wear, to be honest.
You were like, wear colors. I'm like, I don't want to.
Yeah, I know how that is. That's like my whole closet. Well, actually, I have a whole lot of colors in my closet, but I don't wear them at all.
Same, same. I'm like, meh. Okay. So we are good to go and we are live. So, welcome everyone to another segment of Is It Friday Yet? I have a very special guest here, and we're going to get all of the tea and the gems and the heat on being burnt out. And I would like for her to introduce herself and just tell us the dreaded question, tell me about yourself.
Love it, especially for us HR folks. So, I am a career coach like you, but I specialize in helping women overcome work burnout specifically. And even more specifically, essentially, I help people overcome their workaholism. So that's what I do. I'm also a mom of two little ones, a 1-year old and a 3-year old, that keep me quite busy.
Awesome, awesome. So let's just dive right into it. And so this episode, I've talked about being burnt out or before, but I wanted to kind of go do a deep dive because we kind of touched the surface last time. And I know you and I had talked about like the 4 stages of burnout and how to overcome it. So I really want to talk about and get into like those. First of all, how do you know you're burnt out? Let's start with there.
Absolutely. So let's first start with the definition of burnout because I think that, well, so oftentimes people think that they're just stressed out and that what they're experiencing is completely normal, especially in corporate, because a lot of times we're talking to our colleagues, we're seeing our colleagues go through the same things, we're seeing them vent their same frustrations that we have. So at the end of the day, we think that, oh, this is just normal. This is just how it is. But the reality is that's not necessarily the case. You may be in burnout and not even know it. So let's start with the definition. It's a state of emotional, mental, and physical exhaustion that's created by stress. And what happens here essentially is you're experiencing nonstop stress. It's kind of like you're putting your foot to the gas pedal when you're
Mhm.
driving a car, but you're never letting go. It's like you're going from 0 to 60 and eventually you run out of gas, you run out of steam. It's just natural, it's normal, it's life. So that's what burnout is. And the definition that I love to go over also is the literal definition, which is a fire that is totally destructive of something. And this is most oftentimes when we actually recognize that we're in burnout, is when we're looking at the consequences of overworking, of feeling that exhaustion. And so oftentimes we don't realize that we're in burnout because it's a very gradual process, which kind of states the definition of the emotional, mental, and physical exhaustion. And over time, it leads you right into that destruction ultimately. So, really, do you want me to dive into the different phases, Jordan?
Yes, but really quickly, I want to. So you talked about kind of that whole mental and physical exhaustion. What are some telltale signs before we jump into the stages? Because I definitely want to talk about that. But what are some telltale signs that you're burnt out? You said it comes on gradually. So how do we know we're burnt out versus just like slightly stressed out?
So let me kind of go into the phases and that'll actually answer that. So ultimately, what happens is the burnout is essentially it's initiated by typically a few things. One is you've set high goals for yourself in your career, and therefore, in order to reach those goals, you identify that you need to do certain things in order to get them, right? In order to get
Mhm.
promoted, to reach that corporate ladder. So, what you typically do in the ambition phase is you try to prove yourself. You try to prove yourself to your boss, to your colleagues, to upper management, or if you're trying to start your own business, it's you're trying to prove yourself to your potential clients, right? And
Mhm.
in the process, you find yourself volunteering to take on new tasks, get on new projects, take on new responsibilities. And ultimately, your belief that you need to work hard to succeed pushes you to take on more.
Okay.
So, that essentially, typically, people just think that they're stressed out here. And typically, they don't realize that they've set themselves up to initiate the burnout cycle, because in phase one, typically you're creative, you're productive, you're
Mhm.
efficient, you feel like you're working towards your goals, and you're probably seeing some success. You're probably getting recognition from your peers that you're doing a good job. So it only moves you further into the belief. It validates that what you are doing is working. But what's happening is you're creating habits that are do more, please more, take on more, say yes to more, right? And so then that propels you into the if only phase. And that's when you have too much on your plate. And then this is a really big sign. And this is when people may start to actually notice it, is
Mhm.
when the mental piece comes in that I talked about in the definition, where when you're not at work, you're thinking about all the things that you have to do.
Yeah.
And it's like, "Oh my gosh, I've gotta do this, I've gotta do that."
Mhm.
And you call it the Sunday scaries, I call
Yeah.
it the Sunday dread, and that's when you're thinking about Sunday rolls around and your mind starts to catalog what you have to do for the week, and then
Mhm.
automatically you realize that you don't really have enough time to meet your deadlines. You may not have enough time to prepare for those meetings. So this is where the anxiety kicks in, and your mind's telling you, well, you better get started on it now, because if you don't, you're not going to be ready. You're going to have a bad week, and you're going to be even more stressed out.
Mhm.
So this is when the mental exhaustion hits, right? This is when our minds just keep spinning. And in an effort to stop it, and an effort to get our to-do list done, this is when you'll see people starting to cancel plans with family. Maybe
Mhm.
they don't go to their kids' soccer games anymore, or it's here and there, and start canceling plans with friends and so forth. And a lot of times, this is when the hobbies will become sporadic. Maybe it was consistent before, but you're no longer doing this. And then
Mhm.
another big sign is that you're unable to fall asleep because your mind's still racing, still thinking, and then also a lot of times in this phase, you're going to see yourself waking up in the middle of the night thinking about all the things you have to do. It's just this never ending cycle. So that is typically what the if only phase looks like. And then after, typically people stay in this phase for quite a while, because they think that they're able to manage it to a certain degree, and their performance hasn't decreased or anything, but their mind is fully, capacitated with work thoughts. And then
Mhm.
that moves them into phase 3, which is when they'll see more of the emotional exhaustion. And after over time of being frustrated with your circumstances, you start to blame your dissatisfaction and your others. And this is what I them face is the well, we don't have over my work hours. This is just the company culture. This is just what they expect. This is just what it's like to work in human resources. That's just an
Mhm.
example. And so you justify your behavior, but at the same time, you're blaming everybody else for what's happening. And then at this point in time, you're very negative. You're unable to see the bright side of things. You only focus on the negative. And another big sign is that you find yourself easily frustrated. So the
Mm.
emotional side comes out of, you may feel a little illogical in if any little thing could set you off. A coworker says the wrong thing, you have an interruption, there's a change in plans, and you kind of feel like it's the end of the world.
Mm.
And this oftentimes is when you're going to see your performance start to decrease. And due to that, your confidence starts to waver. You start to second guess your decisions. At this point, you're going to probably ask and get validation for making those decisions. Do you think this is a good idea? I need to bounce some ideas off of you. Versus before, you were probably very unwavering in your decision. It was, this is this, we're moving on. But now you're unsure of yourself in this phase. Again, you're having issues sleeping. A lot of times you'll see people have physical symptoms such as
Mm.
headaches, indigestion, anxiety. That's another big one. And then phase 4 is the definition of the destruction. This is when you're in total burnout, and ultimately you've acknowledged that the culprit of your situation is actually you, because not only is your career falling apart, um, maybe not falling apart, that's strong, strong, but essentially it's suffering. And not only is your career suffering, your personal life, your mental health, your physical health, and you absolutely feel like there's no light at the end of the tunnel. You know that you need to make a change, but you don't know how or even where to
Mm.
start, right? So
Mhm.
that's what that looks like. And a lot of times when people get to total burnout, that's when you see them making these rash decisions. That's when you see people saying, enough is enough. I'm just quitting my job. I can't do it anymore.
Right.
You'll see that. You'll see people ending up in the hospital, and people getting, tests for 3 days, and the doctor comes back and says, we can't find anything. It sounds like it's your lifestyle. It sounds like it's stress. So
Mm.
those are some tall tale signs. And I'll send you my burnout checklist, because it goes into
Okay.
detail on the physical side and also some of the mental side, of burnout. What we talked about.
Okay. And then the checklist that she sends me, guys, for you watching live or watching on the replay, I'll put that down in the description so that you guys have access to that. And I was kind of jotting down a couple things as you were talking, because I want to get a little bit into these 4 phases before we talk about how to like get out of them. And
Yeah.
so the first phase, you were talking about how in the first phase, it kind of looks productive and it looks, cool, and people are basically enabling us to continue working that hard. And I wanted to ask why, or have you seen why people, or why we tend to work like that, right? We praise people that work just shy of like their limit versus, hey, let's balance it out.
I think a lot of times, depending on the manager, I would have to say a lot of times they're in their own world and they don't really necessarily see all of the work that you're putting behind,
Mm.
like what you're putting out into the world. So say you're taking time to make everything perfect, and you're putting in a lot of hours to get that quality of work, and then you present it to the world. They're just seeing the product. They're not
Mm.
seeing that you're you know working weekends or that you're staying late, you're coming in early. A lot of times they don't see that, but they praise the result because you're doing good work.
Mm.
But in order to do the good work, you're typically working longer than you should and focusing on things or details that you necessarily shouldn't.
Mm.
And ultimately, what's happening here is you're setting yourself up for habits. Because over time, what happens is if you make the same decisions and you have the same thought process, if I do this, it will get me this. And if I don't do this, then they're going to think I'm incompetent or that I can't handle my workload if I ask for help. If I say no, they're not going to come to me. So these rationalizations of how we make our decisions, ultimately, the more we make them,
Mm.
like the same type of decisions that come from that core belief that I have to do X to get Y, right? Then we're setting ourselves up for creating habits. And over time, we're not even going to realize that we don't even realize that what we're doing is self-sabotaging, where our people pleasing and maybe the perfectionism or the I'm not going to ask for help because if I do, people are going to think that I can't handle my workload and my job. These habits will eventually burn you out, and we don't realize that that's what we're doing because we're getting the pat on the back, you know?
Yeah, I agree. I think people tend to the saying is, work harder or work smarter, not harder. That's the kind of anti-equation to this kind of hustle culture that we've built up. And they say, the more you work, the harder you work, the more you get. And that's not necessarily true. And I do see that when people come to me and they even talk about wanting to move industries, they're probably at at the end of the phase and they're already burnt out and they don't know what to do. And so they're trying to move on. And I can see from what you're telling me, it seems like they could have, avoided that by trying to at least catch it in stage one versus, like, oh, I'm now in stage four and it's,
Yeah.
I've destroyed it. So I think that's super important in terms of people. So this is something that we talked about and I'll get into it because guys, I was actually, we reversed and I was on her podcast as well. So we'll put that up, but we did talk about people pleasing and boundaries and saying no. And so can you talk a bit about how people pleasing, you kind of talked about it a little bit, but how people pleasing is just an innate factor in burnout and then how to actually set that boundary?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So ultimately, we believe it's in the goal. So ultimately, step 1, we have a goal. Step 2, we create a plan on how to get that goal.
Mm-hmm.
And within that plan, it's I need to make sure that my boss sees that I'm putting out good work. And maybe I need to get upper management's attention by producing good work and by
Mm-hmm.
getting on all the projects, right? So, what we're doing is we're setting ourselves up for taking things on. And wait, say the question again. Sorry.
How, no, you're good. So I just wanted to, how people pleasing is basically ingrained in burnout and then how we set boundaries so that we don't people please.
Got it. Okay. So ultimately, it's set up in burnout due to the fact that it's part of the strategy, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But because we don't think about the boundaries, as you just mentioned, we don't have a clear this is going to be the strategic thing for me to get on and then this is not because and we talked about this when you were on my podcast is creating a strategy and a compass of yes and no. So
Mm-hmm.
yes, this is going to further my plan to get to the goal that I want to get to, whether that's, climb the corporate ladder or move further into your business.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, a lot of times we just focus on the yes, this is going to get me there, but we forget to define what will not get us there, what will
Mhm.
not serve us. And that's the key piece, as you highlighted on my podcast, that is going to help you know, like, this type of project is not going to get me further. Helping this individual person with this thing is not going to help me. It's not part of my job. It's not going to serve me. So when you're creating your plan on how to get to your goals, it's important to know what are your yeses, what should
Mhm.
you be working on, and what are your nos. And once you know your nos, ultimately it gives you the power to say, I'm sorry, I'm not able to do that. And you and I talked a lot about this, and you can essentially say no in a way that's going to feel right for you.
Mhm.
You don't have to just say no, end of story, if that's not how you typically communicate.
Right.
And so essentially, you can say no in a way that feels good for you, but you have to kind of explore that. Like, make sure that that's part of your plan, because
Mhm.
all of us in corporate, we know we are going to work with different individuals. We're going to have colleagues. We're going to have our bosses, we're going to have upper management that are going to ask different things of us. And if we don't know what we should say no to, then we're just going to say yes to all of it.
Right.
So that's so important to define that. And then two, get in touch with how do you want to say no so that you feel comfortable doing it. And as you mentioned on my podcast, the more you say no, the more you're going to build that muscle, and it's
Mhm.
going to get easier. And maybe it will eventually turn into a no, end of story. But it doesn't have to be that way to begin with.
Right. Yeah. I think it's almost taught to like you have to be, like super type A assertive and be like, no, that's it. I'm not explaining myself. But if that's not in your personality, and I'm all about going with whatever your personality is, like there's no point in fighting against it to try to, be someone you're not. If you go against it, it's always going to feel inauthentic and weird. Versus if you're just like, I'll figure out another way to set my boundaries and stick to them. And one thing that I heard today is it was interesting. Um, they were saying that sometimes it's okay for you to, this is going to be an unpopular opinion, but sometimes it's okay for you to kind of, nod and agree in certain like chains of command, but like on the pull them to the side and be like, okay, maybe this is not going to work, but here's solution A, B, and C. Because sometimes when it comes to like your boss and you, maybe you don't have that relationship where you're like, haha, no. But if you come with to them with different solutions that might work a lot better, then that is you saying no but coming up with a solution. And I think that's going to be important to not people pleasing, but also not getting like walked all over like a doormat. So that was just
Absolutely.
something.
So true, because of course, if we follow, I think it's like it's part of the women empowerment group that you just say no, but that's just not, we're not all the same like
Mm-hmm.
that. And it's okay to do it in your own way. And I think so oftentimes what stops us is we think we have to say it that way, and then we don't have the courage to say no. So then we just say yes.
Right.
So,
Exactly. You're
so
like,
yeah, you hit the nail on the head right there.
awesome. So I want to get into, because we talked a bit about the 4 phases and getting into it. Now I want to talk about kind of getting out of it, but I want to talk about myths because I always love myth busting and just like letting people know that some of this stuff is just not true. So what are kind of the top 3 myths on overcoming burnout?
So good. So people may totally disagree with me on this, but I have seen it firsthand in HR, and I'll go over it in a moment. But ultimately, time management strategies. We all know that they work,
Mhm.
but when you are in burnout, part of the reason that you got into burnout to begin with is because you're taking on too many things and you're not taking anything off your plate. Maybe
Mhm.
you've to too many you that you more and more to achieve, right? And therefore, a time management strategy isn't going to help you set a boundary. It's
Right.
not going to help you say no, right?
Mhm.
And therefore, that is why it doesn't work. And number two, it's because we're mentally exhausted when we're
Mhm.
run down and we're like, have you ever been in a fight with someone and you're just like, have it your way. Like, sure, whatever. Like, I don't feel like dealing with this right now. Well, I'll
Right.
just do it. Right. So, kind of the same thing goes when you're in the workplace setting. Someone is coming to you and you're like, you know what? I don't have the energy to deal with this. So, I'm just going to go ahead and do it. And
Mhm.
ultimately, that's why time strategies do not necessarily work. They work when you effectively use them,
Mhm.
but oftentimes when we're burned out, it's not going to help us say no. It's not going to help us set boundaries. And then another thing that time management strategies typically don't take into account is that what once took you when you were at your most effective and efficient 15 minutes, now when you're in burnout, your productivity, whether you like it or not, has decreased in
Mhm.
some way, shape, or form. Maybe it's not super dramatic, but it's enough to alter the time frame that it's going to take you to get something done. So if something took you 15 minutes before you were in burnout, maybe you're in the ambition phase, now it might take you 45 minutes.
Mhm.
So you're creating a time that you're creating a schedule for yourself that's not at all accurate. And therefore, that's one reason why it doesn't work. And then we get mad and we blame the strategy.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and then number two, when we're burned out, our ability to follow through and stay consistent diminishes. So,
Mhm.
when we all know when you're inconsistent, you're going to get inconsistent results. So,
Right.
and therefore, the same thing goes with time management. If you're not going to use the time management strategy, you're not going to see the result from it. And this is where I would so oftentimes see in HR, and I'm sure you've probably seen it too. You know, you set up a strategy for one team to use, and it works beautifully. They have great
Mhm.
results. But then you utilize the same strategy maybe for another team, and it fails miserably. And it's because they're not consistent, they're not following it. And additionally, it might not be a right fit for them. As we've talked
Mhm.
about, we're all different. So sometimes we do have to take into consideration our work styles and how we do things. And typically, we don't take that into consideration when we're selecting time management strategies. We're just going off of this is what everybody says works. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Right.
Right.
So,
Exactly.
so that's why that's myth number one. And then number two, it's self care. A lot of times you see people
Mhm.
just saying, just get a walk in, just add jogging to your routine, just do meditation. And a lot of times, what will happen is people will go down the Google rabbit hole and they will start to see all of these self care options
Mhm.
that they've been told will work. And the funny thing is that they've never done them before. And whenever you're trying anything new, you're adding in a level of stress because there's that learning curve.
Mm, okay.
Now you're getting frustrated because you're like, this isn't working. And it's just because you don't know how to do it. You're not giving it the time to do what it needs to do. It might not be a good fit for you. It goes
Mhm.
back to, what do you like to do, right? Like what works best for you.
Right.
And again, our ability to follow through diminishes. So third, adding anything to our plate when our plate is already too full it's just simply not a good idea.
Mm-hmm.
But these strategies work. Don't get me wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Time management and self-care work, but it's not where we start with when we're burned out. It's not how you fix burnout.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why those are myths. They work, but it doesn't work when you're in burnout. And then number 3, what typically happens is after you've tried all of the things, right? You start to blame your situation on your circumstances. So you
Mm-hmm.
think, "Oh, I just need to get a new job. It's just the job. It's just the work culture. This is just everybody expects me to work this many hours because this is just how this company is." And then you move to a different job. And then you find yourself in the same situation, overwhelmed,
Mm-hmm.
stressed out, burned out in a few months. And you're like, and then you think, oh, it's just the job again, or it's something else, but it's tied back to a portion of your circumstance. But I've seen this happen so many times. The biggest indicator that this is taking place is that you've hopped from job to job. Maybe you've stayed in a place a year and then you moved and then you've moved. And it's because there's something missing. And we talked about this on my podcast.
Yeah, no, those are great. Yeah, I think I like what you said, like they're strategies and they work, but they work when they're used correctly, because the common denominator of what you said was adding more onto your plate. So taking up jogging, that's adding more, or
Yeah.
getting a new job, that's adding way more stress. I was just talking to a young lady and she was saying that she basically forces herself to do so many hours of job searching every day, 5 days a week. And I'm like, why? I'm like, you're not getting, your productivity, you would get 3 days worth done because you're so burnt out. Your productivity, like you were saying, is so low. Why don't we try 3 days of an hour, and you're going to get just as much done if you try to stretch it out. And so I think that's something that kind of people, they're just like, if I work more, if I do more hours and go longer and go harder, it's going to work. But like you said, your productivity is like taking a complete plunge. And if you don't, regulate that and stop adding things on your plate, then you're going to eventually get burnt out.
Well, I think the interesting thing is, the law of diminishing returns. People
Mm-hmm.
think that, you're being productive, right? You're validating that what you're doing is working, but over time, people don't realize that time is fixed to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm.
So the more you add, there's only so many hours in a day. So naturally, things are going to have to be deprioritized. Things are going to have to get delegated because time is fixed, even though people think, oh, well, there's always more time. But your boss doesn't always think there's more time. Your deadline is your deadline.
Mm-hmm.
So
Exactly. One of the funny sayings, because I used to say it all the time, you're like, Beyonce and you have the same 24 hours in the day. And then someone kind of broke it down and they were like, no, Beyonce's hours are different because she has cooks and nannies and all these people and cleaners, and you don't have that. And so you have to regulate what needs to get done, especially, I mean, we were talking in sense of like life and personal, but I think even in your career, you have to regulate what you're doing. And in order to have, you need to have a plan and a strategy, because you start throwing spaghetti at the wall, you're going to get, like you said, inconsistent results. You have inconsistent output, you're going to have inconsistent input. So
absolutely. 100%.
So let's get into so we talked about the top 3 myths of overcoming burnout. Now let's go into the steps of actually overcoming burnout, because I know a lot of people, whether they're in their current job or they're job searching, they are over it, they're done, they're sick of it, and they're trying to figure out what the problem is. And like you said, it could be the job, or it could be a cycle of continuous burnout where they're just doing too much and they're not having a strategic plan put together.
Yes. So I want to touch on one thing too, because I've seen this so often. People will say, "Oh, I don't have a choice. If I'm doing three people's jobs and I don't have a
Okay.
choice in uh in the hours that I work. I don't want to work these hours, but I don't have a choice because if I don't, then they're going to fire me, right?
Hmm.
And I want to address this because there people will say, I'm not a people pleaser. I'm not a perfectionist. This is just the cards that I'm dealt.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to bring up that the common denominator is still you because you still have the ability to say, wait a minute, I don't have the capacity to take on more.
Mm-hmm.
And, a lot of times people don't take that step to say, I don't have the capacity. I need help and
Right.
I'm going to say no. And if your boss, if the company you works for says no, you're going to have to. You have to work these hours, mandatory. The reality is you do have a choice to continue working there or not.
Mm-hmm.
So the power is still up to you. It might not be an easy decision to say, I'm going to leave and look for another job, but you still have the power to have those tough conversations. Because I
Right.
think so oftentimes we have this narrative in our head that if I ask for help, they're going to think that I can't handle it. They're going to think I'm incapable. And that's not the reality. We have to do sometimes is simply ask for exactly what we need. So I would push back on those people that are like, I'm not a people pleaser. I'm not any of those things that you're talking about. And the first step of overcoming burnout is the self-awareness. That's why I wanted to bring that up. It's because you have to become aware that you're burned out.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's, you're doing the job of three people and you don't identify with what I said about being a people pleaser or perfectionist or anything of that nature, you still have to identify that you are burned out. And the second step is you have to make the decision to make the choice, the personal choice, because no one's going to do it for you. Time
Right.
is not going to just fall into place for you to have the perfect work situation, the
Yeah.
perfect personal life. You have to
Right.
actually make it happen
Mm-hmm.
on your own. So you have to first become self aware that you're burned out. And number two, you have to commit to the changes. Commit to making the change to figure out what are the changes that I need to make. And if you are that person that you don't identify with what I said about the people pleasing, you can make the decision to move on and to find something else
Mm-hmm.
that you do enjoy and that you're only working one job versus doing the job of three people,
Right.
right? Or if you are a chronic people pleaser, you do have the decision to make those decisions to stop. So ultimately, number one, self-awareness. Number two, make the commitment. And typically, how we get clients to commit is we take a look at what is it going to cost you to continue going down this path.
Okay.
So
It's a
what
good
are
one.
your short-term consequences? For example, if you continue, if you're, if you take a look around and you look at what are your short-term consequences or costs to what you're doing, if
Mm-hmm.
you're working nonstop, you're not seeing your family and friends, you're becoming unreliable, and people don't believe that, you're going to do what you say you're going to do in your personal life because you drop
Mm-hmm.
everything in order to attend to your work life, then you're going to naturally fracture those relationships. So a short-term cost could be fractured relationships. Over time, if you treat people that way, they will eventually, love them and leave them, right?
Right.
Eventually walk away. I've seen many colleagues of mine get divorced because,
Mm.
of 10 plus years of never being home and putting work above their kids, above their spouse. So it's a possibility. That's a long-term cost. So
Right.
you ultimately look at what are the short term, what are the right now, right here costs? And on the flip side, what could this cost me long term? So, like, for example, if you're in a place where you're like, yeah, my performance is up and down, it's not, it's no longer straight up and moving up.
Mhm.
It's like I have to save it when it dips, and then we go back up, and then we go down. Over time, if that continues to happen, your work performance will be noticed and you could potentially lose your job, right? So
Mhm.
that's a serious consequence. So you have to get serious about it. Another way, and it's my personal way of like my individual style of helping people get that commitment, is on some level, you know what burnout is costing you. A lot don't necessarily to have that actually mirror to what it's costing them, but they know deep down, like, I'm getting in fights with my significant other.
Mhm.
My friends are frustrated with me because I'm canceling on them. I feel like a bad mom because I'm never present with my kids. I'm always working late, right? Like at some level, you know.
Right.
So the secret to that, the secret to changing essentially is to find a reason to change that is greater than your pain, greater than your fears, greater than the judgment of others. Because a lot of our people pleasing and perfectionism, it goes back to, oh boy, if I don't do this, I'm not going to get promoted. Oh boy, if I
Mhm.
don't say yes, they're going to think that I'm not a team player, right? It's rooted in those. If I'm not going to say yes to these things, then people are going to write me off and I'm not going to get to where I want to go. So you have to find that reason that's greater than the fears that you have, of the consequences for saying no, of putting up those boundaries.
Mhm.
And the way that I help my clients essentially get that commitment is we identify, what is your purpose? What are you meant to do, right? And maybe it's not necessarily what you're doing now. Maybe it is. Maybe it's in a different capacity. So we ultimately kind of identify that dream career that's going to get you out of bed in the morning. You're going to feel like, oh, like this is it. And essentially, it's much easier to take a look at the mirror and say, okay, um, I am going to be able to make these changes that might be hard. I'm going to have to say no. I'm going to have to put up boundaries,
Mhm.
but it's going to get me that much closer to creating, the business that I've always wanted to create. It's going to get me that much closer to leaving my corporate job to do what it is that I truly want to do and that lights me up. So that reason has to be greater than your fears, greater than your pain. And that's why we
Mhm.
identify what is your purpose. And then after that, the third step to identifying burnout is you look at, what are your obstacles? We all have them. And what I mean by obstacles is, how do you self-sabotage? If you're one of those people that don't think, oh, I'm not a perfectionist, I'm not a people pleaser. We
Mhm.
self-sabotage in different ways.
Mhm.
So you have to really identify what is stopping you from getting to where you want to go. And the reality is we all have them. It's just, our own different brand of what that looks like. And even if you're a people pleaser and I'm a people pleaser, Jordan, it's going to show up differently for you than
Right.
it's going to show up for me. Yeah, the foundation is the same, but what motivates me to say yes and to have like no boundaries is going to be different than what motivates you. So
Right.
you have to get to the bottom of that. And that's why step 3 is we identify what that is, and then we create, ultimately, in step 4, we're going to break habits. We're going to break those habits that led us to burnout, and we're going
Mhm.
to start creating that life to get us towards stepping into our purpose. And we're going to be working on new habits to create the life that we want. And then over time, um, the habits are broken, the bad habits that led you to burnout, and the good habits have replaced it. And you're starting to see the benefits of what those good habits are bringing into your life. So, therefore, you will overcome it. And typically with finding your purpose, because it's going to cut that time frame of
Mm,
breaking habits and creating new habits in half, because you experience this mindset shift of, oh, I can't, my circumstances are what's causing the situation, to no, I have the power, I have the control, I'm going to make this happen, and here's what I'm going to do. So it's a mindset shift from I can't to an I can, and it becomes much easier to break those habits, because you're starting to see what that life could
mm.
look like, what that happiness could look like. Does that make sense?
No, it definitely does. I think that in kind of your definition of kind of overcoming, it's, you talked about your why needs to be strong enough, and when you were saying, like, you know, how self-sabotaging presents in itself, I was thinking about even in like me, like I'm a horrible procrastinator. Another P word. I'm a horrible procrastinator, and I'm just, you know, still working on those limiting beliefs, of another coach word, limiting beliefs, that, you know, maybe I am not going to be able to do something, or, you know, something's not going to work out. And I think a lot of people have, like you said, these obstacles that we need to get through. Like sometimes when I make a decision, I'm like, my heart is pounding. I'm like, okay, I know that I in this moment I'm like nervous and like scared about this decision, but I know in the long run my why, it's going to serve my why, and it's going to serve me in the long run, even though I'm kind of like freaked out right now. So I think that's a good way to kind of put in overcoming that burnout.
Absolutely. And you talked about it too when you were on my show, about you've definitely stepped out of your comfort zone in an effort to make your dreams a reality. But
Mm-hmm.
if you didn't have those dreams in the first place, it probably would have been very difficult for you to step out and to do that. But like you said, you knew that it was going to get you one step closer to where you wanted to go. So it's something that you had to do. And over time, as you mentioned on my show, the more you do, the easier it gets.
Yes.
And then ultimately you're conquering your fears by doing something that you typically wouldn't do. And then the more you do it, all of a sudden, you know, you've already conquered it. You've been there, done that. On to the next. And
Exactly.
unfortunately, fears will keep popping up in different ways. They say what, a new level, a new devil. And that's so
Mm.
true. But at least your why is strong enough to get you, to motivate you to say, well, I'm going to do it anyway, because I know it's going to get me to that new level and the next
Mhm.
level, right?
Exactly. And I mean, it's either you go for it or you stay where you are. And if you're already unhappy with where you are, then there's not like much you can do to kind of make yourself even unhappier, if that's a word, but there's not much you can do to kind of take yourself back down if you're actively trying to lift yourself up.
Absolutely. And you know, so oftentimes we look back on life too, even now, I'm 34. I still look back on life and was like, "Ooh, I wish I would have done this sooner." And
Mm-hmm.
I'm so glad that I'm
Yeah.
doing what I do now. But regret is something that's very real. It's one of those things that the longer you go and regret, the stronger the
Mm-hmm.
emotion gets. And if you're already in a negative space, you're just setting yourself up for more negativity. So, you know, stop asking yourself, like, oh, I should have. And, you know, I wonder what would have happened. No, go
Mm-hmm.
and do it and figure out what would happen. Like, stop living in that, I don't know, maybe I should, like, just go do it, because you won't be disappointed. You're going to have the answer to that question of what would have happened. You'll know,
Yeah.
versus constantly thinking about it. And
Yeah.
you hit the nail on the head about being, you know, you're already not happy now. And part of the reason maybe you don't want to make a change or make the commitment is because it's going to be hard
Yeah.
and it might not be easy. But like, what brand of easy do you want? Like, You know what I mean? Like, do you
Yeah,
want to
that
continue
was
being
hard.
unhappy, or do you want to make some hard choices that might make you unhappy, but you're already unhappy? So what's the big risk?
Mm-hmm.
Especially if the reward is worth the huge payoff of you taking back control of your life and actually creating a life that you want.
Exactly. Agreed. 100% agreed. Awesome. So I think we're almost at like 50-ish minutes. So I definitely want to wrap this up because I want to make sure that everyone, can hop off. But is there anything else on burnout or overcoming that you would like to share with those that are watching live and or on the replay?
Yeah, I mean, I would have to say that when it comes, we haven't really talked about preventing burnout, so
Oh, okay, yes.
I'll just throw in something about preventing burnout. So oftentimes we don't like slow down and figure out what it is that refuels us, what it
Mm-hmm.
is that helps, recharge our brain and helps motivate us. Like I just talked about, having your why being so strong that it motivates you and helps you create the changes a lot easier than it would if you didn't have that strong why. The
Mm-hmm.
same can be done for preventing burnout.
Wow.
You can take the same tactic to prevent, and then in addition, I highly suggest that you build in some time into your day to have that time for yourself to just think, to just reflect.
Mm-hmm.
Because whether you're in corporate or whether you're owning your own business, in order to tap into that true potential, you need to allow your brain to have the creativity. You need to allow your brain to tap into that, because that's where your true potential lies. And
Mm-hmm.
that's what's going to be able to set you apart from your colleagues or from other people within the industry if you own your own business. So, actually setting up time for you to get into the creative space that you need to work on
Mm-hmm.
your bigger goals is extremely important. Um, and then two, again, tap into, make sure that you get an understanding for what fuels you. Do you like to go out in nature? Do you like to go for a run? Do you like to lift weights? Do you like to read a book? Like whatever it is, make sure you tap into that, because that's the one thing that people miss. Everybody focuses so much on the strategy of like, I have to do in order to get, but it's
Mm-hmm.
just as important to create a strategy to refuel your brain, get back, refuel your energy in order
Mm-hmm.
to sustain and tap into that potential. So I would say those two pieces, make some time to creatively think so that you can stand out from the rest.
Mm-hmm.
And then two, make sure that you're recharging, because you're always going to be at 110%, which I can guarantee you your colleagues won't be. They're making the same mistake that everyone else is, which is go, 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 go.
Right. No, that's interesting that you bring that up because I remember when we were talking before we hit record on the or before we went live, and I was making a joke and I was like, "Oh, I'm trying to work, on my business and not in my business." And it's the same for business and career. You have to take that time um to work on your business. So when I say, for the people out there in the land, when I say work in your business is you're working, like for example, you're an employee of your business, right? But when you're working on your business, you're in that CEO mindset, you're in that founder mindset when you're looking at a bird's eye view. Same as for your career. When you're working technically in your career, you're working on the day-to-day ins and outs, down in in the trenches, nitty-gritty. But when you're working on your career, like she was saying, you're taking a bird's eye view of what you want and then kind of playing like the puppet master to yourself. So you're being the CEO of your own career. So that's what I mean when I say work in and on either your business or career. So I think that's a great way to put it.
Thank you. Yes, and I'm so glad that you illustrated it, because that definitely helped make help for everyone to understand. So I appreciate that. And yeah, at the end of the day, I think the last thing that I would have to say is that if you are feeling stressed out and it's consistent or even not consistent, just I encourage you to just take a few minutes to take a look into that and figure out why that might be. And ultimately, take a look at that, figure some things out. And then at the end of the day, you do have the choice. You have the power to make the decisions and to create the life that you want. It might not be easy, but ultimately, like we just said, which brand of happy and easy do you want, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
And
that's it for me. And then I wanted to talk about too our podcast that we
yes.
recorded. Jordan is out, and I have the link. So I don't know if Jordan, if you can pop it in. And I provided the YouTube link as well.
Awesome.
Interview
Let me do that. Oh.
and
Mm.
Jordan all how to get promoted, talks about how to learn how to say no. Well, as we talked about people pleasing and ultimately how to, create a strategy to prevent yourself from people pleasing. So it's a really good interview. We cover all of the things.
Yes. And so she put it in the chat. I'll also be putting it down in the description below so that you guys can click on it and take a look at it. Where can we find you on these internet streets?
You can find me at Tara Reinbolt on Facebook, and I'm also on LinkedIn at Tara Reinbolt. And my podcast is the Burnout to Blessed podcast. So I hang out there quite a bit as well. So those are the three areas that you can find me.
All right. And all of those links will be down in the description for you all. And I just want to say this has been awesome. I really enjoy like getting down into the weeds about this stuff, and just kind of nerding out about it because it's important, right? Everyone wants to do the shiny, sexy stuff, but nobody wants to do like the groundwork that it takes to maintain all of this stuff. So I think it's super important that we have these conversations. And I just want to thank you again for not only us, flipping it and me doing your podcast, but you coming on and doing the Is It Friday Yet segment. So thank you.
I appreciate you having me on. As always, you and I have so much to talk about. So thank you. And I feel blessed to be on here. So I appreciate it.
All right. Awesome. Awesome. So you guys have a great rest of your day. If you're on the replay, make sure you go down and check out all the links. We'll have everything down in the description below the video. And you guys have a great rest of your night. Bye.
Bye.